The prairie lay still under a sky that had been bruised by the last whispers of light. The wind swept over the parched grass in slow, exhausted gusts, its breath barely stirring the air. It brushed against the wooden frame of the cabin that sat isolated in the distance. Inside, the cowboy rested by the hearth, his knife sliding methodically across the whetstone, the quiet of the evening embracing him. Sparks from the fire danced and flickered in his beard, while his eyes grey distant held the kind of solitude that had forgotten how to speak. For years, this was how he lived, the passage of days marked only by the groan of the porch underfoot and the distant cry of coyotes. Nothing ever shifted in his world. Until that night, a sound emerged from the barn soft, hesitant. The cowboy paused, straining to listen. It wasn't the mournful sigh of the wind or the shuffle of hooves. No, this was something different, something human, fragile, and filled with fear. He stood, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots, and grabbed for the lantern. The flame shuddered as he opened the door, stepping out into the sharp, biting cold. His breath turned to mist, swirling in the air around him, while the wind lashed at his face, urging him back to the warmth inside. Yet something about that quiet sound, so small and trembling, pulled him forward, urging him into the dark. He crossed the yard to the barn, the lantern's light casting long shadows on the straw-covered floor. At first, all he saw was darkness, dust, and the faintest stir of movement. Then, in the far corner, a figure leaned close to another, almost as if shielding her. He lifted the lantern higher, and the light revealed two faces, one aged, the other young. The older woman's face was gnarled and weathered, her skin rough as the barren land. Her hair peeked out from beneath a frayed shawl, and her eyes black, calmed his without a flicker of fear, only an overwhelming weariness. The younger woman, no more than 20, was hunched beside her, strands of matted hair hanging over her gaunt face. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her expression pale. The cowboy's grip tightened around the lantern. Every instinct he had told him to be wary. Out here, strangers could bring trouble. But when the younger woman let out a dry, rasping cough, something inside him softened. Without a word, he lowered the lantern, his voice barely above a whisper. "You both look cold." They didn't respond. The old woman's fingers clutched their daughter's wrist, ready to flee, though there was nowhere to run. Het turned away, walked back toward Thekabin, and returned with food, a piece off cornbread, a tin of beans, the last off his coffee. He set it down near them and stepped back, letting them choose. For a long moment, the only sound waist-trembling flame between them. Then the young woman reached for the bread, hesitating, waiting for his permission. When he nodded, she began to eat, slow and trembling. The old woman followed, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she murmured something in her native Etting, a word he couldn't understand, but somehow felt the meaning of. He left them blankets that night and returned to his cabin. Sleep didn't come. The image of their faces, starved and proud, stayed with him. He heard known hunger, but not the kind that came with being hunted. He could almost hear the echo of their suffering in the wind outside, mingled with the cry of the coyotes. By morning, the barn smelled of smoke and warm bread. He had left a small pot of stew on the stove and carried it out without a word. They were still there. The young woman had her mother's head resting in her lap, humming a song that rose and fell like wind through reeds. When he entered, the tune stopped, and both looked up. He blessed the stew before them and left again. No questions, no demands, only silence, and the small kindness of staying close enough to help far enough not to frighten. Days passed in this quiet rhythm. The old woman began to sweep the porch when she could stand again. The young woman fetched water from the stream, her movement slow, but sometimes when he worked the fence or mended the roof, he would catch her watching him, her gaze curious, almost peaceful. They rarely spoke, but something wordless moved between them, like a fragile bridge built of shards. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, the old woman sat by his fire, wrapped in a quilt he'd left for her. Her voice was soft when Sheffenly spoke. "You have no family here?" He shook his head. "None left." She nodded, as if that explained everything. Then she looked toward her daughter, who slept by the hearth, and said, "We lost ours, too." Her words trembled, but her eyes were strong. Thewald forgets those who wander. He didn't know how to answer, so he poured her another cup of coffee. Outside, thunder rumbled across the plains. Inside, two exiles and a lonely man sewed warmth without names. That night, the storm broke open the sky. Rain droomed against the roof. Fierce, and the old woman began to speak again, this time not to him, but to that storm, to the memories carried within. She told of soldiers and burning villages, of how her people were driven from their lands, of nights spent hiding under dead trees while her daughter slept against her chest. The cowboy sat beside the fire, silent, the knife he had been sharpening now idle in his hands. Each word she spoke felt like a weight pressing against his ribs. When she fell silent, he said only one thing: "You can stay here as long as you need." She looked at him for a long moment, and in her gaze was something ancient and grateful, a mother's trust. The wind outside began to fade, the firelight flickering across her lined face like dawn touching stone. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered something so faint, he almost missed it. "You have a good heart, cowboy. My daughter will be safe here." He sat there long after her voice disappeared into the rain. "Safe," she had said. The word echoed through the cabin, soft but heavy, filling the space between loneliness and something hadn't felt in years. Belonging Thuinter gave way slowly, as though reluctant to release its hold on Thelanly land. Each dawn came a little softer, each breeze a little warmer, carrying the smell of grass and rain instead of snow. The cabin, once asylum shelter for one man, had begun to breathe like a home. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, and laughter, small, uncertain, but real, sometimes rose from within. The cowboy felt it before he admitted it. The stillness of his day had changed shape. The two Apache women had turned the quiet into something living. The old woman's strength threatened in fragments. She no longer moved like a ghost, but her breath often. The young woman tended her mother with patience that was on. He watched her sometimes through the cabin window, how she brushed her mother's hair, how she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders before dawn, how she sang in a language the wind seemed to understand. There was no need for words between them. The rhythm of her song and the steady sound of his boots in the porch spoke enough. He began teaching her small things: how to care for the horses, how to tell the Weatherby watching the clouds, how to mend fences with wire and grit. She learned quickly, laughing when the hammer slipped or the rope burned her hands. That laugh, the sound of it, worked its way into his chest, unsettling and gentle all at once. Some evenings when the light was gold and heavy, they would sit by the doorway in silence, the world stretching endless before them. She would trace shapes in the dirt with Aztec, and he would find himself hoping shed never stop. One evening, as dusk spread like wine over the fields, field woman called for him. She sat near fire, her shawl slipping from her thin shoulders. Her eyes, though weary, were bright with something more than life, something like peace. She asked him to sit. He obeyed, uneasy, sensing the weight of what she carried in her. "You have been kind to us," she said, her voice like worn leather, cracked but strong. "You gave without. You fed us when we were nothing but shadows." Her gaze drifted toward her daughter, who was outside gathering water. "I am an old woman. I have walked farther than most hearts can bear. My time is almost done." He wanted to protest, but her raised hand silenced. "She will soon be alone," the old woman continued softly. "She has no brothers, no tribe, no father to protect. The world will not be gentle. Ya have seen it." The firelight trembled against his face. He said nothing. "She's my heart, Cowboy, and you," she paused, her breath uneven. "You have a good one. When I go, promise me you will not let her vanish into hunger and wind. Promise me you will make her your wife, not from pity, but because love already lives here. You just do not see it yet." Her words struck him deeper than any blade. Love, the word frightened him more than war ever had. He lowered his shed, hands clasped, trying to steady the storm inside. Before he could speak, the young woman stepped into the cabin, carrying a bucket of water. She saw her mother's face, pale and distant, and hurried to her side. The old woman smiled faintly, touched her daughter's cheek, and whispered something in herding, something that sounded like farewell. That night, the wind rose again. He sat awake by the fire, watching the old woman sleep, her breathing shallow and uneven. The young woman stayed by her side until the first light of dawn crept through. When she realized her mother's schist no longer rose, she let out now. Only a stillness came over her, deep and devastating, as if she'd been turned to stone. He went outside to dye the grave beneath the cottonwood tree. Each strike of the shovel cut into frozen soil, into memory, into something in him he didn't know how to name. When it was done, they laid her down gently. The young woman placed a carved wooden bed in her mother's hand, a remnant Afar tribe of a lifelong gone. She whispered a song that drifted through its branches like smoke, and he felt he hadn't earned sting his eyes. Afterward, neither spoke. They stood side by side until the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the land in the days that followed. Silence ruled the cabin again, but it was not the hollow silence of before. It was the quiet of two people learning how to live through grief. He tried to work the fields, fix the fences, feed the horses, but his eyes always found her. How she still lit the fire each morning. How she looked toward the cottonwood as though waiting for her mother's spirit. Tones were. Her strength humbled him. It was not loud, not fierce, but unbreakable. Weeks passed before the words came. On evening, he found her sitting on the Apache, the last light of the sun tangled in her hair. He stood behind her, hat in hand, heart pounding like hooves in his chest. "Your mother asked me to care for you," he said, his voice unsteady. "But that isn't why I'm here now." She turned slowly, her eyes searching his. "I want to stay," he said. "Not out of duty, but because I found something here I never thought I'd have again. A Rio Santo live." For a long moment, she said. Then she rose, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his arm. There was no ceremony, no words of promise, only the truth written in their silence. The wind shifted, warm and sweet, carrying with it the scent of grass and earth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring of silver he had shaped himself, uneven but when he placed it in her hand, she closed her fingers around it like it was light itself. The prairie around them glowed in the dying sun. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, a lonely cricketing into peace. In that moment, standing beneath the endless sky, Cowboy realized that the world had given him back what it once took. Not just company, but a home, a heartbeat. And as he looked into her eyes, the setting sun behind her, he understood that some promises are not spoken. They are simply lived.